Hello, everyone. I'm so glad that you're here. Welcome to our celebrations for the Edinburgh Companion to the Essay. My name's Nicole Wallack, and it's my great honor to have co-edited this volume with our lead editor, Mario Aquilina, and our dear colleague, Bob Kauser Jr., who can't be with us tonight. We'll get to fuller introductions in just a minute, but I want to thank a whole bunch of people for making this event possible and this volume possible, and then we'll move along. First, at Edinburgh University Press, thank you to Jackie Jones and Heather Ramsey. I'd like to thank the Divisional Dean of the Humanities, Sarah Cole, at the Society of Fellows here in the Heyman Center, Eileen Galuli, Lindsay Schrum, Celia Gendek, Aaron Fay, and Elliot. I don't know your last name, Elliot, I'm sorry. In the Department of English and Comparative Literature, our chair, Denise Cruz, our DAF, Juliana Drever, and our financial assistant, Gabriel Galindez, and in the School of the Arts, Dean Jenna Hart-Wright, Wendy Walters, Frank Winslow, and Gavin Browning. I want to thank, of course, my colleagues from the Department of English and the undergraduate writing program, and all the students who are either here tonight or who've provided inspiration and encouragement along the way. A very special thank you to Anirban Banerjee and Nicholas Osborne. Anirban is currently a graduate student in English and Comparative Literature, and the other was a graduate alum from history who served as our proofreaders and copy editors, and it was truly heroic work. We're delighted, especially for your presence here, of course, and either in person or on Zoom. So thank you for taking the time in whatever time zone you're in. Tonight's celebrations will introduce you both to the volume generally, but also to the specific contributions of 5 Columbia faculty who are here with us tonight: Alan Stewart, Bruce Robbins, Philip Lopate, Leslie Jameson, and Glenn Michael Gordon, all scholars, practitioners, and or teachers of the essay, and often more than one thing at once. In the packet that you may have picked up, you'll see the table of contents for the whole volume. And since we don't have time here to explore all of the wonderful work of the book, additionally, you'll see just the first pages of our guest contributions. And folks on Zoom, if you would like that table of contents or any single chapter of the volume, we have permission from Edinburgh University Press to make those available to you by PDF. I also want to say that Edinburgh University Press has given us the opportunity to give 3 lucky winners an entire PDF volume of the whole book, and we'll be notifying you about that afterwards. Over the next 90 minutes, Mario and I will provide you with some context for the book, its goals, its challenges, and some of the principles that informed our choices when putting it together. We'll introduce our speakers in the order in which their work appears in the book, and then each of them will speak to what I hope is a couple of fruitfully open-ended questions about the essay and their own lives and work, and I'm hoping that they will also read for us just a couple of paragraphs from those chapters that they've made. If there's time left, and I hope there will be, we'll have some discussion on the panel. And so now I would like to introduce ourselves here. So I mentioned I'm Nicole Wallack. I'm the director of the undergraduate writing program in the Department of English and Comparative Literature here at Columbia University. And my background is in essay studies, in English education, in writing studies and writing pedagogy. My first book was Crafting Presence, and I am delighted to be a part of this conversation. And please meet Mario Aquilina. Will you introduce yourselves?
Sure. Thank you, Nicole. So I'm Mario Aquilina. I'm from the University of Malta, where I teach literary theory, I teach rhetoric, I teach the essay. We've got to be generalists at my university. Teach a little bit of electronic literature. And I've been working on the essay now for a number of years. Before editing the Edinburgh Companion to the essay, I edited another book for Bloomsbury called The Essay at the Limit, which is a smaller volume and focused primarily on a more from a theoretical perspective. And before that, I did some work on style. The first book was on style, the event of style in literature. It's a great pleasure to be here. Thanks, Nicole, for organizing this wonderful event. And I'm looking forward to discussing the volume and the essay with you.
Thank you. So we're going to start here by just giving you a sense of how we put together the volume to begin with. It's just its origins. And I have to say that for me, it started on social media, which I guess you shouldn't say anymore, but it did, because I found out about a conference that was happening in Malta in 2019, right? And that Mario had put together on the essay that would bring together current thinking and current thinkers about the essay. And I said to my colleagues in the undergraduate writing program, let's go to Malta. And to everyone's credit, we did. Could you tell us more about how you thought about the project?
Yeah,
and how it came to you?
Yes, I mean, I'd been working on the essay for a few years, and I thought that I'd like to do a conference in Malta. And the main reason for that was that I came to the essay from the perspective of literary studies, right? So Charles Lem, Woolf, Hazlitt, and also through literary theory, right? Jacques Derrida, Maurice Blanchot. But I was discovering more and more, of course, that there's another tradition, you could argue, with, of course, some similar roots, but branching out in very different directions in an American context. And as I discovered that more and more, I realized that there was, in my opinion, very little conversation among these different branches. And the conference was meant as a way to bring some of these branches together. And the fact that a lot of you came over from America. In fact, if I remember correctly, I think there were around 16 people out of 50, if not more, I think, who were based in America, meant that that conference brought together European scholars of the essay, Maltese scholars of the essay, Asian and also American, and that's where it began in terms of the thinking behind the essay.
Yes.
The conference, behind the essay conference.
So so it was Edinburgh University Press that approached you to bring together this volume initially.
Yes, I mean, they got in touch and they asked whether I'd be interested in editing a companion. Now, I had just started working on a smaller book, and so at first it seemed like a hugely daunting task, because a companion has to have a certain scope and range. It goes beyond that of just an edited anthology of chapters. There's a certain gravitas to a companion, right? And it's 250,000 words long. So I hesitated a little bit, but then I thought that it was a great opportunity, and I thought I would do it. I said to my commissioning editor, Jackie Jones, that if I brought in people who I thought would complement what I know, and that's where you come in, and that's where Bob come in, because I feel that your expertise in the pedagogies of the essay, in the rhetoric of the essay, in the political context of the essay, and Bob's being, an essayist and a teacher of essay writing as a craft, meant that, the three of us could bring an element of, I'm not saying, everything there is to say about the essay, but more comprehensiveness than I could bring on my own. And I also felt that in that way we could combine sort of the European and the American context, and that's why I'm grateful you accepted to be a co-editor, because like that we could accomplish it.
In our early conversations about this volume, we thought two things. One, there's an awful lot of work coming out about the essay. So what are we going to do to make sense of it in this current context? And what is it that this volume could do that other wonderful volumes are not yet doing, or not doing in the same way? And one of the things that we'll be talking about as we talk about the different sections through the book is to say what our intervention is in this particular way. One of the things that I feel like we wanted to make sure of was that the whole book is a scholarly book. We conceive of it that way. We could have imagined it, but we also think that scholarship can sound like a lot of things. It can take a lot of forms, and that should have a capacious view about what essaying is and where essaying happens. And that was a thing that we also wanted to reflect in in the pieces that came through.
Yeah. I mean, our editing process was, I feel, very essayistic, right? In the sense that we met very regularly and we experimented with what the volume should look like. And I think sort of, I don't know if you agree, Nicole, but early on, the idea was how are we going to make this different from other anthologies? Because there are some brilliant anthologies which already exist, great scholarship on the essay. We were aware of other books that were going to come out before ours and others which were going to come out just slightly after that. And we felt that what we could do with the volume, which might be slightly different, would be to focus primarily on the contemporary,
Yes.
right? And that is, we tried to sort of say, listen, let's try to give a kind of contemporary snapshot. That's the term we tend to use of the essay, which meant that we focus primarily on the contemporary. So there's a lot of history, like for example, Alan's chapter, which we're going to be discussing later on Francis Bacon, where there are chapters on Montaigne. So the big names are all there, right? There's Hazlitt, there's everyone, but always trying from an editorial perspective to link them in some way to contemporary thinking for the essay. So the contemporary we thought was a key difference. And the other one was because of the expertise that you bring, Nicole, that Bob brings and that I bring, having in the same volume current thinking on the theory of the essay, current thinking on the pedagogies of the essay, current thinking on the history or poetics of the essay, so that anyone coming into the book hopefully would not necessarily by any means learn everything there is to say about the essay, but get a pretty good idea of where essay studies is now, right? So that was I think the editorial principle that we adopted, right?
It was. And, you know, this is a book made, if any good things come out of pandemic time,
yes.
One of the things that it made possible was for us to have this collaboration, you know, across time zones and times when we were all teaching as well, and everything was happening. So just to say that it took commitment to the Zoom at a level that I had not really anticipated. Let's put it that way. And we really were very purposeful about deciding what it would look like when we would work together to make choices. Shall we turn now to our chapters? So the things that we're going to ask each of our contributors to speak to in some way, if you wish or can. I have two questions in mind for tonight. Before or during reading your paragraphs from your chapter, two questions. How is the essay both a special interest of yours, if it is, and tied to your central interests as a writer, scholar, teacher? So, you know, where is it in your intellectual firmament there? And how did the combination of interests get figured in the chapter you ended up writing for us? So people are very wise and will do anything they want with those questions. So Mario, we're going to move first to the first section of the book, which is about theories and definitions. Will you introduce that section for us?
Of course. So, you know, the book is divided into three main sections, and then there's a fourth running thread, which we'll be discussing later, of interviews, essayistic collaborations. We'll talk about them later. But the first section is called Theories and Definitions. And in it, what we try to do is to answer, you know, the question, what is an essay? What is essayistic writing from different perspectives? So here we group together chapters which attempt that question in some way or another. Whether it is, for example, historically, like Alan's chapter on the birth of the English essay does, or whether that is more in terms of the understanding of the essayistic eye or the essayistic voice, like my chapter does, for instance. We've got Thomas Carson's chapter, which looks at titles, sort of what is it that makes essays from the perspective of titles, or, you know, the philosophy of the relationship between the essay and the object that it tries to capture, as in Erin Plunkett's book. So essentially, the first section tried to answer this question: what is the essay? From different perspectives. So it's a little bit more, let's say, theory focused or philosophy focused. Although you could argue that the way we organize the chapters also has an element of arbitrariness in it, that some chapters could have easily shifted to other sections because that's the nature of writing, right? You don't write about just one thing.
It's true.
In fact, one of the chapters that we have there is of course, Alan's, and I would like to introduce Professor Alan Stewart, who's going to be speaking first. Professor Stewart is a professor of English and Comparative Literature at Columbia University. He's the author of several books, including most recently the Oxford History of Life Writing, Volume 2, Early Modern. And he's the director of the Oxford Francis Bacon, for which he edited Volume 1, Bacon's Early Writings, 1584-1596. And he's currently working on Volume 2, I believe, late Elizabethan writings, 1596 to 1602. So let me pass on the words to you, Alan. Tell us your thoughts about the essay.
Thank you, Mario, and good afternoon to everyone. I have to have a confession. I am a cuckoo in the nest here. I don't really do essays. I don't teach them. I don't research them. I barely read them. But I do Francis Bacon, and Bacon did do essays, and so here I am. As Mario said, I'm editing Volume 2 of the Oxford Francis Bacon, which is a new scholarly edition of Bacon's works that is organized chronologically. So my volume on late Elizabethan writings runs from 1596 to 1602, so it includes the first printed edition of Bacon's essays, which appeared in January 1597. Now, given the chronological bias of this edition, most of my attention until this point has been focused on that moment of the essay's appearance in 1597. What this commission for this book very helpfully has done is to encourage me to think more about the reception of Bacon's essays between 1597 and today, which is quite a long time. What became clear is that Bacon's essays have been thoroughly eclipsed in our time by the essays of Michel de Montaigne, if you're looking for a sort of origin story. His first French edition predated Bacon's by 17 years. The first English translation comes 6 years after Bacon's essays. And the continued centrality of Montaigne is easily adduced from the titles of recent collections, such as Essayists on the Essay, Montaigne to Our Time, and On Essays, Montaigne to the Present. I was feeling very marginalized quite quickly by this reading. And certainly Bacon's essays are a long way from fitting that Montaignean model, especially in the first 1597 edition. That one contains just 10 very short essays, which are largely aphoristic, each new thought indicated not simply by a new sentence, but by a pilcrow, a little paragraph sign. It feels very loose compared to Montaigne. The effect, as one critic put it, is of impersonal didactic essays in sharp contrast to Montaigne's distinctively self-revelatory compositions, while a fellow Bacon editor concludes there is little in style or thought to link Bacon's stark observations with Montaigne's personal ruminations. So it's Montaigne who is central to the 21st century conceptions of the essay, with his personal self-revelation corresponding to the personal nature of the genre that we recognize. And yet when I started to explore their reception, it became clear that from the 17th century England, Bacon's essays set the pace. English essayists who followed him, and there were many, there was just an endless vogue of essay collections in early 17th century England. They celebrated Bacon for breaking the ice for their essayistic invention, going so far as to castigate Montaigne for his failure to write essays in the proper Baconian mold. I think there's a little bit of xenophobia mixed in here. The British are good at that. In surveying these early English essayists, it became clear that what Montaigne was writing was simply too developed, too sophisticated. By contrast, these writers insisted on the sense of essays as incomplete, premature attempts. In reaching to describe the new genre, metaphors abounded. The essayist is a painter's boy trying out his hand on a board, a scrivener trying his pen before writing his work, a circumspect runner trying for a start. Essays are undigested motions, imperfect offers, loose sentences, an embryo. Bacon himself wrote of his essays being but fragments of my conceits, that he was forced to publish prematurely, like a man whose orchard is vulnerable to theft from neighbors and who gathers his fruit before it's ripe to prevent stealing. But along with that, I discovered that Bacon's essays were endlessly appropriated and rewritten, not only by Bacon himself, who revised them constantly through his life, but by countless other writers who seem to have seen the essays as a prompt to their own writing. Taking a single line of the first essay of Studies, the line reads, "Reading maketh a full man, conference a ready man, and writing an exact man." I tracked borrowings in a bewildering variety of texts: political, religious, educational, professional, and medical. Some were wholesale liftings, others showed varying levels of ingenious adaptation. A Protestant polemicist used Bacon's sentence to exhort his English readers to study the United Provinces. A clergyman used it to discuss Peter's questioning of Jesus in Matthew 18:21. Another deployed it to assert how ministers should read, confer, and observe. Another to describe how Jesuits studied together after lectures. Another to talk about the timeliness of reading. A treatise on preternatural tumors, I'm very wide-ranging, used it to discuss the training in physics. Another to discuss the duties of a clerk in the Court of Common Pleas. Another to eulogize the Landgrave of Hesse. I found adaptations of the essays in personal manuscript collections by book collectors, scholars, attorneys, politicians, playwrights, translators, poets, antiquarians, and aristocrats. It's just everywhere in the 17th century. Perhaps my favorite is a manuscript at Trinity College, Cambridge, where a scribe has copied out Bacon's 10 essays and then added 10 of his or her own. Bacon is nowhere mentioned and the scribe remains anonymous. You can't actually tell there's any shift. So I'm going to give you my two concluding paragraphs where I got to with this. My point in recovering this long history of borrowing is not to claim that all these writers are necessarily alluding to the authorial figure of Francis Bacon when they copy or rewrite or continue his essay writing. Instead, I suggest they take part in a specific kind of intellectual work that Bacon imagined for his essays back in 1597. While Montaigne presents the essays as a book of one substance with its author, Bacon's essays present themselves as only the first step in an ongoing collaborative conversation of reading, writing, rereading, and rewriting. This might suggest an alternative tradition for the early English essay collection, a tradition that's become lost as we invest so heavily in the personal and the expressive essay inspired by Montaigne's. But what would it mean to look back to Bacon as the founder of the English essay tradition rather than to Montaigne? His essays, and here comes some metaphors, tender infants of a newly bound apprentice, fragments of conceits, raw and undigested, imperfect offers, pheasant's eggs looking for a good house hen to do her part. Valorize the work in progress over the final product, future possibilities over present knowledges, the communal and collaborative over the individual and solipsistic. Their built-in dialogism means that Bacon's essays are not solely the published work of a particular historical figure at a particular historical moment, the essays that I was editing from 1597. Those are just the essays or imperfect offers, as he puts it, but an entire tradition that sees knowledge as future-oriented collaboration with all the open-ended possibility that entails. Thank you.
Thank you, Alan. So that if the problem of definition is a challenging one, I would say even more challenging is to think about how you situate the work of the essay in the world, as how would you even begin that conversation. Our second section of the book is dedicated to publics, pedagogies, and histories. Although, as you can see, like with everything in the essay, it's kind of messy and, history will never just stay in one place. But let me say that one of the things that I was really grateful for as an editor and a colleague and a co-editor of this book is how we decided to situate pedagogy. Because in too much work around the essay, it is often the case that if someone is writing a book to theorize the essay, the chapter on pedagogy may come last as a kind of afterthought. And to me, we knew from the beginning that pedagogy had to be in the volume, but our question also was, should it have its own section? And I thought, I don't want just writers from the United States writing about essay classes or essays in their classes. I really am hoping that we can show how integral it is to the wide context. And so the work that is happening in this chapter really thinks about essay, and I would even say the pedagogical in a way that's much more expansive than exclusively in the context of a classroom, although I revere classrooms, of course. My own essay is a part of this chapter on reading and the essay. And in that piece, I end up making the argument that while that essays essentially rely on readings, and that the essay as a genre is, I don't know, social enough or grateful enough for that fact that it ends up also reading the writer in turn. So there's this kind of reciprocal relationship. Our colleague Bob Kauser writes very much about the essay as a piece for the classroom and out of the classroom in his chapter, Heretical Hearts and the Infinite Game, Why Teaching the Essay Still Matters. And it does. I'm so delighted, though, that we have two of our contributors for this section here tonight. Bruce Robbins, whose chapter on politics and the English essay, which he will speak about, and Philip Lopate, the post-war American essay, the liberal imagination, and the contemporary essay. I'll just introduce them both now, and then I'll ask them to move into giving us their readings and thoughts about their pieces. Bruce Robbins is the Old Dominion Foundation Professor in the Department of English and Comparative Literature at Columbia University. He's the author of Secular Vocations, Intellectuals, Professionalism, Culture, Perpetual War, Cosmopolitanism from the Viewpoint of Violence, The Beneficiary, and most recently, Criticism and Politics, A Polemical Introduction. His works are mainly in the areas of 19th and 20th century fiction, literary and cultural theory, and postcolonial studies. Philip Lopate is professor of writing in the writing division of the School of the Arts. He's championed the essay in the various anthologies. He's edited The Art of the Personal Essay, The Glorious American Essay, The Golden Age of the American Essay, The Contemporary American Essay, and his own essay collections, including Bachelorhood, Against Joie de Vivre, Portrait of My Body, and Portrait Inside My Head. In 2022, he received the Christopher Lightfoot Walker Award from the American Academy of Arts and Letters to recognize his contributions to American literature. And so, Bruce, if you would give us a start, and thank you so much for being here.
How is the essay a special interest of mine? How is it tied to my central interests? And how did this combination of interests get into my chapter? These sound like softball questions. They're actually, when you start thinking about them, much harder than they sound, or this was my experience. Working backwards, I'm trying to write a book about atrocity, literary representation of atrocity, and my chapter is about atrocity and literary representation of atrocity. Easy. To which I add, and it goes with our subject tonight, novels, which I have been much more central to my scholarly interests over the years, turn out not to be so good about representing atrocity. And I don't know whether you accept creative nonfiction as you don't like that one. Anyway, let's say essays are much better. Okay, will you tell them why later? You will, okay. How I got interested in the essay, harder to answer than I thought it was going to be. Two things occurred to me. Neither of them probably is of any interest to anyone except me, but I'm just going to say them. One is being trained in the 19th century because there's just a lot of cool essay writing in the 19th century, American and English. And you read that stuff and it's like, it's really good. The other thing, and Nicole, this should give you some satisfaction, was really a pedagogical thing. I got asked to teach theory. And you don't think of theory as a bastion of refined prose and sensibility, possibly? You're not letting on what you think? But it turned out it was not the worst thing in the world, let's say, to want to try to write like Walter Benjamin, which was what I found myself wanting to do in senior year in college. And even, and I'm going out on a limb here, I didn't want to write like Jacques Derrida, but there were some one-liners that were really good. you know, and so I speak only one language and it is not mine. Think about that. It's wise. Let's say I'm interested in thinking about criticism, as I am. I wrote this book about it, as a version of what Michel Foucault calls commentary, which is to say secondary writing about a primary text, right? The general category. There are worse ways of getting at that and the complications of that hierarchy between primary text and secondary texts than doing what I did this past semester, giving students Terry Castle's sort of semi-obit of Susan Sontag and Andrea Long-Chu, her profile of the supermodel Emily Ratajkowski, because in both cases, it's like there's a celebrity and there's an ordinary person, and I'm the ordinary person looking up at the celebrity. How do I do self-deprecation? And maybe does that self-deprecation have something to do with a kind of hierarchy in criticism? I don't know. It seemed to me a more fun way of asking theoretical questions of the students, and not just fun, but also giving them a model of good writing as opposed to probably most of the other stuff that I would have been giving them. I had a self-deprecating thing about not being an essay writer, which I decided I was not going to do. I've been told that I overdo the self-deprecation thing. But if you will explain why that's funny, I would be very curious to hear. Anyway, the closest I think I've ever come to being awarded the status of essay writer was, I think, Nicole, you may be responsible for this, when an article of mine called The Sweatshop Sublime, which had been published in an obvious place for essay writers, PMLA. Nobody even knows what that is. Was taught for a while in university writing. And this happened because a graduate student of mine who was teaching university writing assigned it, I think, in order to tear it to shreds. And as a result, I was invited to address the writing program, and a lot of people showed up. This may have had something to do with the fact that free sushi was offered. So the takeaway from this experience, if you have the money to offer your audience free sushi, do it. You will get a larger, might have done it, you know. Anyway, even if there are a lot of consumables out there that are being produced by sweatshop labor, there's probably not a lot that you, the consumer, are likely to do about it. That's what I said in my essay. I think that's why my graduate student wanted to tear me to shreds, and it got me a gig in front of the free sushi eaters. And here is a paragraph. It's only one paragraph, but it's a long paragraph, so you won't be sorry. I mean, that it's not two. If certain theorists of the essay have prized the genre for a programmatic inconclusiveness that seems the polar opposite of political commitments, Orwell helps explain their perspective. For him, politics is made up of lies and evasions because it's a region of commitments that are absolute and unwavering. It has no room for the merely exploratory. The essay, as many of its admirers habitually remind us, is etymologically an attempt, meaning that by its nature it is tentative, modest, provisional, anything but absolutist. If so, then politics is indeed antithetical to it. Orwell makes this dilemma seem inescapable and insuperable. But like many other dilemmas, it's perhaps more apparent than real. We know from his own writings that his political experiences of Burma, Spain, and working for the BBC were rich in complexity and ambivalence. Orwell himself cannot have thought there was no way around his dilemma, given that he took up again and again the challenge of writing about politics. He does not name the attraction that keeps him coming back to politics, in spite of the lies and evasions, the folly and the hatred. But it does not seem too much of a stretch to identify that attractive force as the consciousness that what's riding on the struggles happening in the unhappy zone of politics is nothing less than the fate of those one loves. The circle of those one loves takes in more than immediate family and friends and the life one wants for them. It's not infinite, but it's hard to say where the circle ends, who would be left outside it. Its expansiveness might help clarify why Orwell took the trouble to do so much political writing, why he acted as if it was after all possible to accomplish something as a political writer that was worth accomplishing. In order to escape Orwell's dilemma, it ought to be enough to look more closely both at what is meant by politics and at what is meant by good writing, essayistic or not. That will reveal what sort of accomplishment has been possible for the political essay, and will maybe even leave us wanting to make an attempt of our own. Thank you.
First, I want to thank Nicole for putting this event together. I have been involved in the essay for over 30 years now. My initial interest in the essay was that period of Lamb and Hazlitt and their interest in Montaigne, but that spread to up and down the history of the essay. And I should emphasize the word history because my interest in the essay has always been to see it as a conversation across centuries. So in spite of the Edinburgh Companion's emphasis on the contemporary essay, I think we do the contemporary essay a disservice if we don't look at the roots from which it sprang. So I began trying to teach the history of the personal essay and assigning various books to my students and forcing them to buy too many books and making me Xerox too many essays. And so finally, I had the idea that maybe what we needed was an anthology of the personal essay, the art of the personal essay. And I kept waiting for one, and I realized it had to be me that would put it together. So I did. And went all the way back to Seneca and Plutarch, and through the Chinese and Japanese and the Germans and so forth, and Americans. That anthology, The Art of the Personal Essay, became widely adapted and is still being adapted. And so publishers wanted me to do another anthology, and eventually I got the idea of doing one dedicated to the American essay. And I started gathering a lot of material on the American essay, so much so that when I put together that anthology, it was 2,000 pages long, and the publisher said, "This won't do." So they were kind enough to let me do 3 volumes. The first one, a kind of basically the arc of the American essay, from Cotton Mather to Zadie Smith. The second one was going to be the golden age of the American essay, which was a period that I was particularly interested in, 1945 to 1970. And the third would be the contemporary essay. So I'm going to read 2 paragraphs from my essay on the post-war American essay, 1945 to 1970. This is the first paragraph. It seems to me that there are certain historical periods when the essay suddenly comes to the fore and is popular and talked about and relevant before sinking back into a more typically comatose, commercially wan state. The 18th century periodical essay of Addison and Steele and Samuel Johnson, the 19th century romantic essay with Hazlitt and Lamb, or the early decades of 20th century Britain with Virginia Woolf, Max Beerbohm, and George Orwell are all examples of such spikes. Another such efflorescence occurred during the post-war World War II period of 1945 and lasted for a few decades, let us say until 1970. It was an exceptionally fertile period for essays in the United States, and one would have to go back to the mid-19th century American Renaissance of Emerson, Thoreau, Melville, and Margaret Fuller for comparable flowering. Now, one of the things that was said during this period was that by Lionel Trilling was that there was a kind of liberal consensus that liberalism was the dominant ideology of the moment. So I wondered what could have been a connection between liberalism and this efflorescence of the essay. This is the second paragraph. Now I am going to make a leap and claim that there is a relationship between essayism, that is the practice or faith implicit in essay writing, and liberalism. My point is not to defend liberalism as a political philosophy, but simply to show a mutually beneficial overlap between its temperament and that of the essay. Some of the attributes with which the essay has often been associated are skepticism, including self-skepticism, thinking against oneself, open-ended speculation, freedom, adaptability, avoidance of system, and refusal of dogmatism. In eschewing rigid, polarizing, revolutionary postures, it seeks out the middle way. The impulse toward moderation goes all the way back to Montaigne, whom Lionel Trilling cited as the ideal for the liberal critic, and who was always advocating equanimity and avoidance of extremes. As was Ralph Waldo Emerson, who said, quote, "I think I have not the common degree of sympathy with dark, turbid, mournful, passionate natures. Very hard it is to keep the middle path. It is a very narrow line." To quote William H. Gass, this lack of fanaticism, this geniality in the thinker, this sense of the social proprieties involved, the essay can be polemical but never pushy, are evidence of how fully aware the author is of the proper etiquette for meeting minds. If there is too much earnestness, too great a need to persuade, a want of correct convictions in the reader is implied, and therefore an absence of community. Theodore Adorno, who certainly had no problem taking ideologically firm stances, nevertheless was drawn to the essay's contrarian dialectical potential, saying, quote, "The innermost form of the essay is heresy," and insisting that, quote, "the essay does not strive for closed, deductive, or inductive construction. The essay proceeds, so to speak, methodically, unmethodically." So that is part of my attraction to the essay, and I would say immodestly and not self-deprecatingly that I'm probably more identified with the essay in this country than anybody else.
Okay, thank you both for that. We now turn to a feature of the book that we really were not sure this was going to work, and we were so glad that it did. And this has to do with our features of contemporary essayists in focus. So one of the decisions that we made early on was that we wanted not only the presence of scholarly thinking through the essay, but also scholarly thinking through that took place from people who were very steeped in writing essays in the public sphere to really reach the broader public, and also who could speak to their work as practitioners. This is something that Bruce kind of alluded to before. We could talk a little bit about later, that I love to talk to writers about how they do their work, and have been doing that for a very long time. And we were so grateful and glad that when we sent out the messages to 8 of the most prominent practitioners in the contemporary essay now, that included both editors and essayists, they said yes. I don't know why everybody said yes, but we were glad that they did. And they gave so fully in their pieces their ideas and their wonderments They share their insights into their influences and their approaches. And I want to say that some of us see in the essay a praxis that draws important connections among the work of literary critics, creative writers, journalists, editors, and writing and rhetoric studies theorists, students and teachers. So it felt really urgent that we have those in conversation. When we decided to include them, we made the choice to make them have the form of essays themselves. And so although they took hours of interviews to make happen, we absented our editorial presence as a visible component of how these essays were put together and what writers we were able to ask and who answered this call. Robert Atwan, David Shields, Jamaica Kincaid, Caitlin Greenidge, Brian Dillon, Rebecca Solnit, Claudia Rankin, and of course, our guest tonight, Leslie Jameson. So I'll introduce Leslie now. Leslie Jameson is Associate Professor in the Writing Division of the School of the Arts. She is the New York Times bestselling author of 4 books, 2 essay collections, Make It Scream, Make It Burn, and The Empathy Exams, as well as The Recovering, Intoxication and Its Aftermath, and a novel, The Gin Closet, a finalist for the Los Angeles Times First Fiction Award. The Recovering was named the best nonfiction book of 2018 by Entertainment Weekly and the best reviewed memoir of 2018 by LitHub, and was a finalist for the American Booksellers Association Book Award. Both Make It Scream, Make It Burn, and The Empathy Exams were finalists for the Penn Diamondstein Spielvogel Award for the Art of the Essay. And I couldn't be happier. Thank you.
Thank you, Nicole. Oh, thank you, Philip. Yeah, thank you. I'll just echo thanks for putting this together. It's really thrilling to be here. And I wanted to start just by sharing a few thoughts on the form of my contribution to this anthology, which you so helpfully elucidated. But it's an interesting form to have a back and forth conversation that then you edit into a written document, and then I edited back, which was another form of conversation, those edits. And I actually think there was something interesting that came up in what does it mean to speak to human consciousnesses, having ideas, thinking together in a way that's different than we can think apart, and then to translate that into a written static document. And there's actually something that comes out of that method of speaking and then being surprised by oftentimes what comes out of your mouth in response and what order it comes out in and what form it takes. And that actually feels not entirely dissimilar to essay writing, for me at least, when it's happening well, which is to say, one of the things that I like about essay writing is that it feels formally and structurally and process-wise like it can court surprise, or it does, at least for me, function as a way of courting surprise, being surprised by what I discover or think about my own experience, being surprised by the ways that public life and private life can speak to each other, being surprised by the ways that personal narrative, cultural criticism, reportage, all of these things that we think of as part of some of the strands that make up like the hybrid essay, how can they speak to each other? But in any case, surprise always feels central to my understanding of what an essay is doing when it's doing that work well, and surprise comes out of conversation with a particular directness and concreteness. So there was something that felt appropriate and actually interesting to me about the form of this contribution as something distinct from just a written essay or an argumentative essay that I might, write on my own. Anyway, I wanted to start with this idea that's part of this contribution here, but also gets a little bit to my history, my own history with the essay as a genre. I sometimes say that I came to the essay as a mistress genre. Part of what that means is that I had always thought of myself as a fiction writer. My first published book was a novel. I studied fiction when I was getting my own MFA at the Iowa Writers Workshop. I really started writing essays in earnest when my second novel was going badly, which is really when the essay as a form started to feel like a kind of mistress to me, I suppose, a secret, almost illicit zone of exploration and play. Essay writing was not the thing I was supposed to be doing. I was supposed to be doing this thing that I had told myself was an ambitious intellectual project, working on a big historical novel that had nothing to do with my own life. The relationship between ambition and that which has nothing to do with one's own life is an interesting intellectual tradition that has its own lineage. But anyway, I was trying to write this essay that was far away from my own life, stuffed with research, but it was totally dead on the page. And essays as a genre felt very alive. And when I teach the essay or talk about the essay, I like to talk about the essay as a mistress genre for at least 3 reasons. One, it's a way of helping, and maybe I wonder we'll have to think about the rise of adultery in the post-war American period and whether that has something to do with the essays of. But the thinking about the essay as a mistress genre helps me articulate certain forms of structural and intellectual freedom I appreciate in the essay, the ways, for example, that it has always helped me bring together various threads of my own life and thinking in addressing myself towards certain core questions living at the center of any given essay. So my lived experiences as a friend, a lover, a partner, a daughter, a mother, my life as a reader and a consumer of culture, my life as an archive rat. It lets me, the idea of the mistress genre also lets me talk in a more narrative way about the ways that so many important dimensions of creative life, I think, involve surprise and disruption, things not quite turning out how you planned, following secret passion projects, letting yourself follow unexpected turns and developments, which is to say, I thought I was a fiction writer and I turned into something else. You basically never know what the future holds. And then this third sense of a mistress genre I get at because to me, it captures a different affective texture in the writing of essays than that more commonly spoken of, like ambivalence or tentativeness, or that to essay means to try, the form of the attempt and a kind of provisionality or thinking against oneself, all of which are parts of my intellectual experience when I write essays. But there's also a sense of kind of getting away with something that often comes to me when I'm writing an essay. And that's a very different kind of affective texture than inquiry, essaying, trying. It has a more of a thrill, or there's a feeling of sometimes mischief to it, or like there's nothing telling me that I can't do it this way, or that I can't juxtapose these 2 ideas, or even these 2 ways of thinking about experience. I can move between like high and low culture in this way. So I think there's something generative and rich to me in exploring that texture of like getting away with it as part of the essay as well. And I guess the last couple things I want to talk about, I'm timing myself here, but could talk about the essay for hours. I think, so for me, when I first started to write essays, it was really a kind of nonfiction workshop that I had taken by chance. And I started out by writing more strictly personal essays. But the form really came alive for me when I started to put personal narrative structurally and conceptually in conversation with other forms of inquiry. And really a breakthrough essay for me in that vein was called In Defense of Saccharine. It ended up becoming part of my first collection of essays, the Empathy Exams. And it wove together an interrogation of my own relationship to sentimentality, and I guess more broadly to the idea of excess feeling and the shame of excess feeling, certain anxieties about living or speaking with excess emotion. It thought about that shame in relation to the cultural history of artificial sweeteners and certain literary ways of thinking about critiques of sentimentality. And I think for me, part of when I look back at that is like, why was this a breakthrough essay in terms of my relationship to the form? And I think part of it had to do with that kind of methodological, okay, you can do personal narrative, cultural criticism, history, like the buffet style. I'm also a fan of actual buffets. But I think there was also something about shame that was really an animating force in the writing of that essay, the shame of excess feeling, the shame of writing about feeling too crudely or too directly, the shame of being a person who at that point in my life would consume 6 packets of Equal and a single cup of coffee when I workshopped that essay, I remember I came into workshop and there was just like a single jar of agave syrup sitting on the desk in front of me. It was like somebody was like, we're gonna really break the fourth wall and just worry about your health right now. But anyway, there was a feel. I think that shame is often for me really a propulsive force in writing, not only because there's often a kind of intense feverish energy attached to trying to figure out those parts of ourselves or our experiences we're ashamed of, but also a way that if shame can sometimes for me feel like a force kind of driving me deeper into like the claustrophobic crawl hole of the self, I think there's something oxygenating about being able to explore the engines of one's shame also with an outward looking eye towards like life outside of one's own private self. Anyway, the last thing I'll talk about is just the idea of, for me, if kind of, I guess the paradox or tension of like, if part of what was freeing to me about the form of the essay was that there weren't as many rules attached to it, or that it felt like a form that could kind of make room for everything, what it felt like to then become very practiced in writing a particular form of essay, and that actually kind of became a bit of a personal brand. So like the Leslie Jameson essay was a term that people would use to describe not only like a mode, maybe not by any means that I was the only person practicing it, but of bringing together the personal and the cultural, the personal and the reported, but also a certain tone of like generous or compassionate ambivalence, where it was like, you might think these people are crazy, but like, what if we look deeper into their souls to find this level of meaning or something? There was a certain kind of almost like a little, a brand signal that felt like it was attached to it. And I could feel myself kind of falling into the grooves of form. So part of, over the past 15 years, part of what it has meant to me to keep renewing my relationship to the essay has been thinking about how to find and excavate and pursue new challenges and forms of newness within that form. And I think the most difficult and rewarding of those pursuits was probably trying to write like a very long book length essay, which was my book, The Recovering, which is 450 pages long. Early drafts were like 800 pages long, but trying to think about how to bring together those braided forms of inquiry while sustaining a conversation with a reader or a reader's engagement over a much longer period of time.
So one of the things that several of our contemporary essayists, Leslie and others like Brian and Claudia, often spoke about is the way that the form of their writing arises almost organically from their thought. As Leslie said, sort of to quote what you've just said, there are not, from the perspective of a writer, of an essayist, there are not many rules, and I can make room for everything. And that's one of the ways in which we often talk about the essay, right? That it can do anything. And that seems a little bit paradoxical, right? Because we're sort of talking about a form from the perspective of, well, it's freedom from certain expectations of form. Of course, you can, I think, identify recurrent patterns, but it seems to me that it's extremely difficult to come up with a list of formal characteristics that, you know, an essay has to have, as opposed to a list of characteristics that some essays have, whether that's brevity, whether that is, for example, the personal. You know, Francis Bacon's essays are not necessarily personal like Montaigne's. And, you know, this seems to be a recurrent issue, right? And of course, indirectly, most of the chapters in the volume address this issue of form. Now, the final section then, partly, however, includes a number of chapters which address this issue a little bit more directly by looking at the essay in relation to, let's say, neighboring forms, right? Trying to understand what the form of the essay might be by looking at other forms or other genre. That's another issue. In fact, you know, some speak about the genre of the essay as actually being anti-genre, a resistance to genre. So what they do in this section is to look at the essay from the perspective of, what could the form of the essay be if you read it alongside other neighboring forms. One recurrent thread of thought in the book, not only here, is it's one of the things, for example, I write about in my chapter, but it's also present in others, maybe whether we should ask the question of the spirit rather than the form of the essay. And listening to our speakers today, we heard things like experimental, self-reflection, which to me seem more like a mode of thinking, a mode of writing, rather than a quality of form as such. But in the final section of the book, what we have is a number of interventions which try to address this issue of form head on. So, for example, what is the relationship between the essay and philosophy? We had, Derrida, Bruce mentioned Derrida. And of course, there's a tradition of philosophical writing that presents itself as essayistic. So Kurt Borge, for example, looks at Montaigne, but from the perspective of a philosopher, right? Arlene Ionescu looks at Curran's fragments. So she looks at the aphoristic, the fragmentary, the theoretical in its relation to the essay. We've got a chapter by Dirk van der Beek on the science essays. An essay is used for the communication of scientific knowledge. We've got a chapter by my colleague at the University of Malta, Ivan Carlus, on columnism in the essay. We were surprised to find there was not a lot of writing about the differences or the overlapping between the column and the essay, which was something worth looking at. And we've got a number of other chapters in this section, including, of course, that one by the speaker I'm going to introduce today, Professor Glenn Michael Gordon, who's going to speak to us about his chapter called The Essay as Transbody. There's been a recent surge of interest in the essay as a genre understood in terms of gender. So there's been several writers who've written about this, the essay as a body, if you will. Philip Lapate, of course, has a collection which already brings that issue up. So Glenn will probably speak a little bit about this. So Professor Glenn Michael Gordon is Assistant Director of the underwriting of the undergraduate writing program at Columbia University, and also Editor-in-Chief of the Morningside Review. His most recent essay, For Pedagogy, How to Teach Gender to Students Who Didn't Know They Had One, addresses the challenges and opportunities around teaching self-proclaimed straight men about gender and sexuality in first-year writing classes. Previously, he worked as an editor and writer for a variety of popular periodicals. So, Glenn?
Oh, I remember to turn it on for you, not for myself. So yes, as you heard before I came to Columbia, I was a journalist, and for me, one of the big bridges was one of the last things I wrote before I came to Columbia was a cover story for New York Magazine about my body and my sexuality. And I wrote about an experience with unsafe sex. And as I was hearing Leslie, you talk about essays, and certainly the vulnerability, I didn't know what was more unsafe. The topic that I had been writing about, or the fact that I was going to write it and publish it in New York Magazine, where people were going to read it. This is before the internet, and during that week that New York Magazine was out, I would literally go on, let's call them dates, and go to a person's house and see that magazine on the cover, on the table of their, and I'm like, oh, I'm in there. That essay got a lot of attention and made me really interested in writing about my body. And I decided to get into MFA at Columbia School of the Arts, where I got to read amazing essays like Portrait of My Body by Philip Lopate, and really thinking about how we write bodies. And one of the things that Philip writes in his essay, Portrait of My Body, is what a wonder to be so misread. And as a queer person who thinks about gender and bodies, I often think of misreadings. I did volunteer work at the Trevor Project, and it's a crisis hotline where LGBT youth would call in crisis. And one of the things we were trained to do is, if we had to call the police, this was a national hotline, if someone was in danger, we were told, do not use pronouns, do not reveal the gender of the person that the police or the EMS may be showing up to. And that is because the person that they see, they might read their body as a different gender. And that could make the young person more unsafe than how they already were, which was quite unsafe if we were calling the police. And so I bring this up because how my life and the essay come together. There's this really excellent book called Crafting Presence by Nicole Wallack. And there's a chapter in it about reading called Era and Illumination. And as I was reading her sentences, I found I was just thinking about the trans body and those experiences that I had at the Trevor Project. Nicole writes, we may not understand, talking about reading an essay, that reading is an act of faith, but readers can never just be supplicants to text. Writers and their work make demands on readers. And I'm thinking, well, our bodies, aren't we making demands on what people are seeing? And Nicole wrote, we may not understand their difficult ideas or challenging prose, and so we reduce them to ideas we can understand. And I couldn't help think of the trans body, of how often people who are looking at a trans body might reduce them to something they can understand. And Nicole offers us an opportunity when she writes, to be good readers, we must be able to be delighted by a text. Imagine that text as a body. Delighted by a text, but also puzzled or even shaken by it in some way. And I think there are a lot of queer bodies that are asking us to just shake some of our beliefs and see them in the way that the author intends. So I, maybe in the spirit of my essay, I did a little bit of refiguring. In case you'd like to see, I like to look at things when someone reads them. I wonder if you would pass it. Thank you so much. So this is a little bit from different places of the essay as trans body. And in it, I do quote that essay that meant so much to me and so many other people, Portrait of My Body, and starting with that quote, what a wonder to be so misread. So there is no body as misread as the trans body. In her book, Assuming a Body, Transgender and Rhetorics of Materiality, Gail Salomon explains that in thinking transgender, the body of which one has a felt sense is not necessarily contiguous with the physical body as it is perceived from the outside. The essay can enable the trans writer to position the authentically felt sense of the body in the forefront for readers. It takes courage for any body to reveal itself in detail, but it does not necessarily engender the same precarity. The way a form is read or misread is in critical relation to its precarity. The more a form deviates from easy understanding or classification, the more it may be viewed with skepticism and disdain. Reflecting upon writing about his transition, Aaron Raslink identifies the double standard that leads to skepticism of trans bodies. In essays about the writer's own body, readers would typically consider the essayist the ultimate authority. However, as Link states, to stand vulnerably in a position of authority before a group is also to be a minority object of a majority's gaze. Trans essayists may not be granted authority by readers, even or especially when making claims about their own bodies, right? Again, thinking of those youth who we couldn't trust their bodies would be read correctly. In her body essay of the same name, Ricky Welchins asks, "What does it cost to tell the truth?" She proffers an answer. "I guess if your sense of self matches closely with the cultural grid of what you should mean, and you find those meanings pleasing, then the truth doesn't come too expensive. For the rest of us, though, it can cost a great deal." Perhaps trans essayists are moved to write body essays in part so that the essay can stand in as a body that performs and endures the labor of self-questioning and self-expression and truth-telling on behalf of the body that wishes to just live and be free of all that. If, as Tori Peters remarks, the essay is a place for otherwise unspeakable truths, it can also serve as a body that can express those truths with less precarity. Link explains that this is what writing his body makes possible. When people cannot avoid stigmatization in person, they can create equal representation through text. When a body is so stigmatized and engenders so much discomfort in others that just stepping out one's front door can put a trans person in grave danger, taking the risk of making oneself readable textually may present a safer passageway for moving forward.
So thank you everyone for that reading, these wonderful readings. In the time that we have some time. I want to invite our panelists to speak back to any of the pieces that you've heard at the table or the comments that people have made. And potentially we can also open this up to our friends in the audience here. But I wanted to give an opportunity for people at the table to begin.
I just want to say that I really connected with something Leslie said about the desire to do mischief. It's something that often gets me going in writing an essay. And so I think that there is an element of risk, which is very, and of confronting the squeamish, like when you were talking about shame. So then really the question becomes how to do that without being tactless in some ways, because you want to be mischievous, but you don't want to rub it in the reader's face in a way,
Well, I think to me that makes me think about one of the things that you have said about essays, and in particular about personal essays, that has meant a great deal to me, and that I think I keep thinking about because it keeps meaning new things. But I think it's connected to what you were just saying, where, and forgive me, it will be horribly embarrassing if I'm misquoting you, but the problem with most confessional essays is that they don't confess enough. Does that sound right?
Yes, absolutely.
But I guess to me, it's like thinking about what might make something like a tactless or non-generative foray into shame or articulation of something, rather than like a wrestling that like gets us somewhere. It feels like it's connected to this question of like what a confessional essay that's not confessing enough. To me, part of what that means is to confess the surface of things without digging underneath them, to say, I cheated on my husband, to say, here are, 6 people I slept with in the last hour and their name, you know, whatever it is. Not that there would anything be necessarily morally wrong with sleeping with 6 people an hour. I don't know. I didn't, for the record, but just that idea of like, you know, kind of confessing actions without using it to do something. And to me, that's like one of the major misunderstandings of personal writing at all, is that you're somehow saying what you did because you think it's intrinsically interesting or extraordinary or special or the worst thing that's ever happened to anybody, et cetera, et cetera. It's like, no, and you're not necessarily using your personal experience for any of those reasons. It's just a beginning. It's just a way into these questions of like, what does it feel like to be alive? And what are the 10,000 reasons that anybody does anything that they do? And so to me, it's like maybe the difference between tactlessness and mischief has to do with confessing enough, following the confession of action or experience to this kind of those deep places of inquiry where you are willing to not be entirely sure that you know yourself, and you follow that unknowing to some place that's more interesting.
Well, I agree with that, but I also think that for me, it's always to find some humor in it, you know, and that becomes a way of gaining perspective on oneself.
A lot of the trans essayists I read spoke about this a lot, that in fact, one trans essayist I write about was told that she couldn't publish a book. She was a journalist, Julia Jack, that she couldn't publish books that she wanted to write until she published a memoir about being trans. On what many trans authors now are feeling too is that the memoir or some essays are asking them, it's not just a tell-all, it's a bear-all. They have to, they're asked to disclose all sorts of private details. And so for some of them, what they've really said is the essay has allowed them to reveal more and yet reveal only what they wish to reveal.
One of the things I'm wondering about in relationship to the activity of revealing is the question of what Rebecca Solnit always talks about is breaking the story. So what story needs to be broken? Not only an individual story, but this is the politics. This is the question of what story you attach to. And so, Bruce, I'll answer your question from earlier about why the Sweatshop Sublime. In part, it's because to me it does the work of destabilizing an understanding of what we think our politics are for and where they come from and the kind of inappropriate comfort they give us too often. And I thought that first-year students should be about that.
Well, I'm obviously really grateful that, you know, you did give that to the students. I also have a funny feeling, which I didn't find the right words for, in remembering that whole scene. I mean, one of the things I thought is that, and this is part of the response that I got back, is it's really not an activist essay, right? You know, it's got a lot of ambivalence in it. Maybe not as much compassionate ambivalence as it should have, but definitely a lot of ambivalence. And I think that the graduate student who was teaching in the writing program who wanted to assign it, this is not you initially, I think, she was really pissed that it was not more of an activist essay. So I found myself thinking, I would hate to think that the pattern here is to make sure that you're not writing something activist, you know, and then you're more likely to be successful when you write an essay. If you don't, you know, come out of it sort of waving a flag and telling people the barricades are that way. Yeah, we got some experts here who are nodding, said, great, you know, no, it can't be activist. Go ahead, tell me.
I don't know. I think I agree that there are few clearly activist essays, but they exist. I think you'd argue that Rebecca Solnit in particular would be one and very widely read.
June
and,
Jordan.
of course. But I think this also links to a question I had, and I was going to bring in Alan and anyone else who would like to talk about it. There's a very strong tradition of the personal, right, which we've been talking about. We're drawn towards that discussion when we talk about the essay, and sometimes the confessional, which is even more personal than just the personal. I'm also intrigued by writers who are not so confessional, where the I is a little bit more hidden, let's say. So, of course, Virginia Woolf is incredibly intimate when she talks about illness and not being ill, but she does not talk about her illness. She talks about some others. But there is also a tradition, you could call it a suppressed tradition, of the essay, starting from Francis Bacon. You know, there are people who argue that the way that Francis Bacon writes, and therefore his followers, very rich tradition of non-personal essays, is not an essay, which I've always found problematic. Right? To me, that exclusion of the non-confessional or non-personal from the essayistic is something that I am not sure I would agree with. And I think the volume goes into that tradition too. And I wonder what Alan thinks about the essays that, you know, he wrote about in terms of this relation to the personal, how you think of their essayism with or against this personal element in their writing.
I mean, the essays that I work on with Bacon are sort of scrupulously impersonal, which is a choice, obviously. They're sort of evacuated of first-person statements. When he starts revising them, though, it doesn't take long before that starts slipping in. It doesn't become the organizing principle of any of the essays, but occasionally there will be a personal voice. It's usually in parentheses. Something will start slipping in. And I noticed when I was talking about all these various adaptations and sort of starting with Bacon's essays, copying them, that particular manuscript, the minute that the person starts copying them, it slips into a kind of a very different voice and a lot of second person addressing going on, as if there's a kind of a move where these writers want to drag it into what they are doing, and the impersonal gets clouded slightly. It doesn't like suddenly swing into full Montaigne, but there's a way in which there seems to be a tension at work, even in the very earliest and most Baconian moments, that the impersonal doesn't quite win out.
Yeah, I just wanted to say that in a lot of my favorite essays, where the word "I" never is introduced, if you think about writers like Edmund Wilson or Susan Sontag or Lionel Trilling, we feel the personality coming through in every sentence, you know, whether they never speak about themselves or never tell us anything about themselves. We feel that we're getting a glimpse of a whole character, you know. So the very notion of impersonality seems to me almost impossible.
Can I jump in? One of the reasons why I think I never thought I was going to be an essayist is I didn't have enough sensibility in that sense. You know, you need one. But that makes me consider whether we might want to make room for people without sensibility, or, you know, without the right kind of sensibility. So I'm thinking, again, in this kind of somewhat more activist, or not exactly activist tradition, someone like Chomsky, you wouldn't think of him as a stylist, right? And it's severely impersonal, but he's an important essayist, no? I don't know, Alan, whether you think it's, you know, the Baconian tradition there or some other tradition.
Don't we get a sense of Chomsky's personality in spite of the fact that he's not necessarily a literary stylist?
Yes.
I just want to suggest that Chomsky and Sontag, who's very much a stylist, one of the things that's possible is that if we think of where the person arises is in the idea, right? If essay, the drama of essay is the drama of having an idea, then in fact, there it is. We don't have to use the person. To my mind, the personal impersonal it's not moot. It's just not the most important thing.
Yeah, if we're tracking somebody's thoughts, that's the drama. Right.
Yeah, sometimes in my teaching, when I'm chatting with students about the various forms of plot that might be possible in an essay or really in a work of writing, there's certainly the forms of plot that we might be most intuitively familiar with, or that might first come to mind, which is the plot of what happened. And, so many thinkers, Vivian Gornick comes to mind, have articulated in such beautiful and helpful ways, like the difference between the situation and the story, or what happened, and the forms of meaning we might make about what happened. But I also talk a lot about intellectual plot line as an alternative to the kind of narrative plot line of what happened. And I think the intellectual plot line is another way of thinking about the drama of having an idea. And I certainly would agree with the fact that, to me, some of the most personal essays never include the word I. And I think sometimes there's just a beautiful craft achievement in the way in which, presence comes to us in many forms, and personal disclosure is not always doesn't have to be there as one of them. But I also think that sometimes, to me, the presence of the personal feels unmanaged and unknown beyond behind a kind of delusion of objectivity. Like, because my I is not here, that allows this essay to be a sort of purer form of reportage or a purer form of criticism. And I think that kind of the unmanaged but often overwhelming and sometimes, to me, stifling presence of the personal in the unarticulated I doesn't always serve a piece well. So I can read a piece of journalism and think, wow, this piece feels absolutely suffused with a variety of personal baggages that I can't quite name, or sometimes they almost seem to be announcing themselves. But it's like, I think sometimes it can serve a piece beautifully. And I think sometimes it feels like there's a refusal to wrestle with one's personal relationship to a subject that, means the personal is present, but not fully interrogated in the ways that I think sometimes bringing the I in more fully allows for a kind of interrogation and deeper investigation of the relationship between self and subject that isn't always at play.
Any last thoughts? This is final call.
Well,
last
I
thoughts.
actually wanted to, when you said you were going to answer Bruce's question from earlier, Nicole,
Yes.
I thought you were going to speak to essay versus creative nonfiction,
Oh.
which I would actually love
Okay.
to hear you kind
sure.
of throw down.
Okay,
bit.
I'm ready. Too many things to say. Okay, so I think creative nonfiction is a meaningless term. I think it's meaningless. It's not a genre. It doesn't speak to either what nonfiction can do, or how it works, or what its reach is, or any of the things that would be helpful about terminology. So instead, when we think, I want to talk about essays, I want to talk about memoir, I want to talk about genre, because I believe in the work of genre studies, and in particular rhetorical genre studies, that tell us that genres are not static forms, but, as Carolyn Miller said back in 1984, genre is a form of social action. And that means that we have to care what we call things, and that what we call things imply or give parameters to the kinds of interactions that become possible or impossible.
Okay. I don't have a horse in this race, one way or the other. I feel like creative nonfiction makes an institutional space in which the kinds of things that you care about can flourish, right? I mean, it's not a genre, but I mean, I can ask Leslie, The Recovering, what's the genre of it? It's not, it's got a lot of literary criticism in it, and it's a memoir, but it's a work of, what rule am I breaking by thinking of that as creative nonfiction?
Well, I always think of my problem with the term creative nonfiction is like saying good nonfiction. Nobody sets out to write uncreative nonfiction. So if I were to substitute one, I would say literary nonfiction.
This could get messy. But it already is. That's the whole point. I would call the covering what you call it a book-length essay. There are book-length essays. They exist already. And the question is then what is the work that it does in the world by being in that particular form?
Somehow they wouldn't let me put book length essay in the subtitle. They felt like that wouldn't get it on the New York Times bestseller list. I actually did, I mean, right, really to this question of genre, we did have a long debate about subtitles for that book that really was, I think, a debate about genre. They wanted to put memoir in the subtitle. I felt suspicious of my own aversion to memoir because I thought, well, what are the reasons that I think that memoir is? Are there reasons I think memoir is a shameful or unambitious genre, and where have I internalized that set of feelings from? But I also felt, to your point, that particular book has a lot of personal narrative, but also has a lot of other things in it. So, maybe critical memoir is the phrase that I've used sometimes, but why we ended up calling it Intoxication and Its Aftermath was that it kind of skirted the question of genre and allowed the book to hopefully speak for itself.
I think Bruce's point is important, that sort of the term creative nonfiction, I'm not a fan of the term, even though I have had to use it for institutional purposes, is that it allows these forms, which are often very resistant to genre definitions, to exist by being given value within the context of a university, right? So essentially, what are you teaching? Collection of texts. But what kind of texts? And I guess the term creative is there to give this sort of the literary that Philip alluded to, the sense of value to the genre or to the text, right? So I'm not a fan either of the term creative nonfiction, but I have a problem with finding an alternative where you want to create a space for these texts, right? Where you want to sort of create for example, the university I come from, the units I started teaching on the essay were 7 years ago, the first units on the essay, because of course ours was a more traditional department which covers the canon, quite fully. So how do you create a space for this other collection of texts? So I guess if there is an alternative which allows me to bring in memoir, literary journalism, the essay into this unit, I'll gladly take it. But in the meantime, I haven't managed to find one yet. And so I guess that's the relevance of it.
I would just say I don't mind the term literatures of fact as a possibility to emphasize the literary. I'm just spitballing here. But we have to ask this question. Everyone, it's time for us to draw a dotted line to this conversation and to thank everyone here for their wonderful contributions. Thank you, everybody who's joined us on Zoom. And if you're here, we have no sushi, but there's a little something else. I hope you'll stay and talk informally. And at home, I hope you're doing whatever you need to do to have a wonderful night. And thank you very much for attending.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.